Our next speaker is John Eaton. John is an assistant professor of medicine and gastroenterology and hepatology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester and is helping manage the very large population of PSC patients there. John is going to talk to us about environmental risk factors in primary sclerosing cholangitis. John.
Thank you, Keith. Well, good morning, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'd like to thank the organizers, particularly Ricky and David, for the invitation. It's also wonderful to be up here with Keith Linder, who I consider my first mentor in the study of PSC, and learned a great deal about the disorder from Keith, as many of us have here in the audience. So I've been tasked with speaking about environmental factors that have been associated with PSC, and that's what we'll spend the next 15 or so minutes reviewing today. So I'll focus this talk really in two portions, covering the breadth of the literature reviewing both non-dietary and dietary environmental factors that have been affiliated with PSC. So as we know, PSC and the cause of PSC remains a puzzle. Of the reported known genetic loci, they only appear to contribute to at least a fraction of why one individual may develop PSC and another may not. This has led many to hypothesize that there could be other factors at play, such as factors in the environment. And this has led to a number of additional studies in this arena. So in terms of several non-dietary associations, this is what we'll spend the first half of our talk reviewing. Cigarette smoking has probably been the single most widely studied environmental factor affiliated with PSC. And a lot of this started by the decades-old observation of the relationship between smoking and inflammatory bowel disease. In this slide, it summarizes some of the key points in the earlier literature that have focused on ulcerative colitis and tobacco use, and that smoking was associated with the decreased odds of being diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, and even providing nicotine could improve ulcerative colitis symptoms in a select number of patients. And among individuals with ulcerative colitis who did smoke, stopping smoking could sometimes flare their symptoms. The exact opposite observation has been seen in Crohn's. So in the mid-1990s, this led to the question of what could the relationship be between smoking and PSC. And so let me just walk you through and orient you to this figure. So this is a plot which shows some of the key studies that have examined the relationship between tobacco use and PSC, both with and without inflammatory bowel disease. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the study author and when it was published, the number of cases, which in this instance were individuals with PSC, and healthy controls, or the comparator group. The green dot corresponds to an odds ratio, and the horizontal bar going through that is what we call a 95% confidence interval. If that crosses this vertical line over 1, it's not at least statistically significant. However, if it is to the left of that line, of that vertical line, it would be more prominent in controls. And so in summary, what this shows is that studies have consistently observed that cigarette smoking appears to be more commonly associated with controls in comparison to those with PSC, i.e., smoking in PSC is uncommon. So this naturally led to the question is, could this be related to the common presence of ulcerative colitis in this cohort? And so several authors have tried to examine this, and our colleagues in the Netherlands have a recent publication that nicely explained this. And indeed, when comparing individuals with PSC with inflammatory bowel disease to inflammatory bowel disease controls, the odds of smoking continue to be reduced in those with PSC. However, this relationship between smoking and PSC in individuals without inflammatory bowel disease is somewhat less clear. And so this is another one of those figures that summarizes the literature that examined individuals with PSC without inflammatory bowel disease and compared them to healthy controls. While one study, published in 2002, showed at least a decreased likelihood of smoking in those with PSC, this has not been consistently reproduced in other subsequent studies throughout the years. And so how do you summarize this somewhat confusing literature? Well, I think we could say that individuals with PSC and inflammatory bowel disease are less likely to smoke. What does this have anything to do with in terms of the underlying pathogenesis of PSC? I think is frankly unclear and somewhat speculative. I would say that the relationship between smoking and PSC among those who do not have inflammatory bowel disease is somewhat less clear. This may be due to a variety of reasons. Perhaps we just didn't have the statistical power to detect that relationship in those other studies. But what I would say, and it's important to note, is that there's insufficient quality evidence to conclude that smoking protects against PSC. We wouldn't want anybody to start smoking just for this. Okay. So I'm just going to dedicate a slide on a really important topic, and there's going to be other discussions about this as we go forward, but I think the most important emerging environmental association or factor affiliated with PSC is the microbiome. And this is a table that was recently put out by Dr. Hirschfeld and colleagues in Gut. And it nicely summarizes some of the emerging literature that is beginning to say and show that there are indeed differences in the microbial diversity among individuals with PSC and individuals who do not have PSC. And so I think that's going to be a key relationship that we will see more of, and I think maybe Dr. Carlson may discuss that a little bit further as well after me. So what about female-specific exposures in primary sclerosing cholangitis? There have been a few studies which have found that there is decreased use in both hormone-based contraception, hormone replacement therapy, and at least a relationship or a correlation between having more children and being diagnosed with PSC later in life. And indeed, at least one study found a relationship with having an increased odds of having recurrent urinary tract infections and having PSC. These have yet to have been attempted to be replicated, though, in future studies and are interesting observations that at least require further study. So now on to some key dietary associations in the emerging body of literature that has examined this within PSC. Okay, so this is a study that maybe many of you in this audience perhaps participated in filling out quite a long and lengthy questionnaire form. It had about 1,000 individuals with PSC, both with and without inflammatory bowel disease. Those with inflammatory bowel disease are represented by this green circle. Those without inflammatory bowel disease, which included about 259 individuals, are represented by this red circle. And so this study asked a number of dietary questions and dietary habits and found that there was at least a trend towards consuming more fast food and fried food among those with PSC, regardless of the presence of inflammatory bowel disease, when compared to healthy controls. In addition, there appeared to be a relationship with consuming meat that was cooked at higher temperatures and for longer, i.e. more well done, in both PSC with and without inflammatory bowel disease when compared to controls. So similarly, there appeared to be a decreased likelihood, rather, of consuming grilled or barbecue meats, fish, and vegetables among those with PSC, regardless of the presence of inflammatory bowel disease when compared to controls. So in addition to these other dietary associations, another important diet is what we drink, and coffee is one of the most commonly consumed beverages. And there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that there may be some global coffee benefits in health as a whole, and also perhaps liver-related health. Granted, these are retrospective studies, but there have been a number of studies which have shown that there appears to be a decreased likelihood of having more advanced fibrosis, decreased risk of hepatocellular carcinoma, and liver-related death in retrospective studies that don't involve patients with PSC. So this naturally led to the question, well, could coffee what's the role in the relationship with coffee and PSC? And in 2014, 2 studies were done independent of each other and were done essentially in parallel, which examined this question. And indeed, they found that if you look at the proportion of coffee consumers who are regular daily coffee consumers, that was in fact lower, as you can see here on the left, among those with PSC compared to healthy controls. And when coffee was consumed, it was consumed to a lesser degree or fewer cups in a given day, as shown here on the right. This was the case for PSC, but interestingly, it was not the case for PBC. when that was examined. And what was interesting is that among individuals with PSC, coffee consumption was associated with a lower alkaline phosphatase, as shown here on the left, and also a lower ALT, as shown on the right. So coffee drinkers who had PSC tended to have lower liver tests. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean cause and effect, it's just an association. So what about outcomes in coffee use? This was a study that was just published online, so this is hot off the presses just a few weeks ago. And it examined patients with a variety of liver conditions who were currently listed for a liver transplant at a center in Germany. And among those included about 82 individuals with PSC. And at the time of listing for transplantation, their coffee intake and habits were assessed and assessed thereafter. And for patients with PSC, there appeared to be a relationship with a decreased or with an increased transplant-free survival among those who were coffee drinker, as shown here on the Kaplan-Meier curve. So this is a cumulative transplant-free survival here on the y-axis, on the left, and then the transplant-free survival here on the bottom. And so coffee drinkers tended to do better. However, as a point of caution, when this was examined by a different set of authors, retrospectively, such a relationship was not seen. Okay, so how do we put some of this together? I think one take-home point would be to interpret this with caution. And so often these studies are picked up in the lay press, and how they're delivered to a general audience can sometimes lead to confusion. So I would say when interpreting these retrospective environmental studies, I would do so with caution. Why is that? They're subject to a variety of biases. Recall bias, for example. It may be very difficult to recall a given exposure at a given point in time during a very stressful time in life. It's often very difficult to determine the timing of one given exposure relative to the disease onset. It may almost be impossible to determine that in many cases. And there are a variety of potential confounders. So what do I mean by confounders? Well, one example of that might be the relationship we've seen with coffee. I personally have a number of patients who have inflammatory bowel disease who absolutely will not drink coffee because it makes their colitis symptoms worse, coffee being a natural laxative, of course. So is this why we're seeing that relationship? Don't know. It's difficult to say, but that's an example of a potential confounder. Another important point is that these are associations. They're not causal, and they don't necessarily mean that altering one's habits will have an impact on the disease course, at least based on what we know now. But I think these studies are important in that they do generate new hypotheses and new questions of inquiry that we could then follow and examine in future studies. So I would summarize this talk by the following. As of now, there's no environmental smoking gun, and that there is a lack of strong evidence to support that dietary changes can really attenuate PSC progression. I think there's a question mark, at least with coffee. In terms of future studies, it's going to be critical that we use validated instruments or questionnaires to help assess exposures and really pay attention to how we select our controls for these studies. Prospective assessments of exposures in PSC-related outcomes is needed and is currently underway. And it would be ideal if we could determine the specific causative agent in a particular exposure and how that relates to a certain outcome. For example, coffee has 1,000 compounds in it. What is it about coffee that may be important? We simply don't know. And also important, and perhaps the most important, will be to make the transition and to start examining how environmental factors interact with each other, such as the microbiome and our diet. How does that interact with the patient? Or how does that influence a disease in a patient? And then also, how does the environmental factors interact with the genetic factors? I think that's something that Dr. Carlson will be touching on here in a few moments. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for your attention and all your time. I look forward to your questions.